So here I'm going to talk about the philosophical foundations of postmodern therapies, which we typically think of as solution-focused, narrative, and collaborative therapy, and to talk a little bit about how these, the philosophical foundations and how this grew out of systemic family therapies. So, now, if you are studying systems therapy, you read that chapter, those chapters in your textbook, and you get to the postmodern therapies, they all feel really different, right? You're like, oh my God, that's so different. But the truth is there is an evolution here, and there was just a little boop change in metaphor, but from second order cybernetics to postmodern, it's a very small step. So it really was an evolution of these ideas. And because what happened was in second order cybernetics, it shattered this idea that the therapist is this neutral outside observer seeing the ultimate truth of their client. And it really began to realize that how we are describing our clients are distinctions. We're drawing those distinctions from our theories and our DSM. And so it's a reflection of our thinking, not their lived truth, right? And so it's really the metaphors that end up changing that shift things into a social constructionist framework. But there are some shared assumptions. So the first is that a person's lived reality is relationally constructed. Systemic therapists talk about it in terms of how they reinforce and circular causality. But circular causality is we are creating our reality together. Both ways of thinking really look at how an individual's identity and symptoms are related to the larger social systems that they are a part of. And so this is in both approaches. They just talk about it very differently. In systems, especially traditional family therapy systems, we're going to be talking all about the family, but the systemic concept, applies to their community, their society that they're a part of, their subgroups that they're a part of, right? Their school systems, their work systems. It's just a whole bunch of systems on top of systems. But in family therapy, we talk about the family therapy the most, but the actual theory has all of these different layers. And when you move to postmodernism, they're much more focused on these higher layers and not just the local family of origin layer. Both approaches do a lot of changing one's language and how a problem is described to alter how it is experienced. So they did a lot of reframing in traditional systems work and how an individual's behavior makes sense within the family context. And in postmodern approaches, they do a lot of how they even name the problem, label the problem. They use externalization to see it as separate from you, but they're using language to shift your relationship to the problem in both approaches. And in both approaches, truth, reality is always relational. It is always constructed within a relational context. And so having this very perfect, pristine, clear, neutral, objective outsider perspective is conceptually impossible both within the systemic frames and postmodern frames. Okay. So let's talk about the metaphor shift. So so systems theory looks at family as a system. That is a metaphor. It is a metaphor to describe, help understand. It's a distinction that the clinician is bringing to help understand what they're observing. Where in postmodernism, they switched over to a textual metaphor, right? So that they use the metaphor of a narrative and of text and dialogue to describe what they're seeing and how reality is being constructed. So much of the difference between these two schools of therapy really come down to the metaphor that they are using to describe human interactions. So moving into postmodernism here. So one of the things that they will say is that they are skeptical of objective reality. So they're skeptical because it's anything that we define as healthy and normal always has and is always informed by a broader social context. So you can think of it this way, just, simply, most of us are well aware that in various cultures around the world, how much distance between is polite between you and a stranger is wildly different across different cultures and contexts. But when you're in that context, and that's what you live day to day, it's very real to you. This is rude, this is not. And so realizing that so much of what we label as healthy or normal is really from within, is socially constructed, within groups. They talk about, there's Ken Gergen once described reality as being mute, meaning things don't come and experiences don't come with an objective description of their meaning, right? There's no prepackaged meanings. We are always creating that within our various social contexts as to what something means or what it doesn't mean, right? And so you may have something like a chair, right? That may seem like such a neutral, obvious, object. But if you're from a culture that doesn't have a chair like that, it's perceived totally differently. And so just realizing that there isn't some inherent meaning ascribed to anything, that it is constructed by the communities in relationship, that we make sense of what these things mean. This is reminding me in classic Buddhist training, when they were training monks 1,000 years ago, one of the exercises they would use in Tibet was, looking at, you have this concept of a chariot, right? So this was a kind of like a car back then. They had a chariot. So at what point, if you take away the wheels of a chariot, is it still a chariot? If you take away this part of a chariot, is it still a chariot? If you take the chariot apart and have all of its parts laying down, is it still a chariot? At what point does a chariot lose its chariotness, and is no longer considered a chariot, right? And so it kind of just exemplifies how there's a certain point that's pretty arbitrary where we decide when it is a chariot, when it's not a chariot, right? So, and we do this with everything in our world. So chariots are just a very simple example to help you realize like everything. And then when you get into words like, oh my God, so-and-so was mean to me, or that was rude. Wow, that has got 1,400 layers of cultural meaning on top of things like that. Because if we can't even decide when a chair stops being a chair or chariot stops being a chariot, when we start looking at inanimate objects and experiences and giving our labels to that, it really breaks down quickly. So they talk about reality being constructed. So meaning that any truth we have of what is good and what is not, there was a community dialogue. Now, yes, we bring that into our heads, and there's a point where we, within our own minds, even construct meaning, but it's all drawing from the broader social discourses around us. And so there are different schools of postmodernism that look at these different levels, with constructivists looking at what is happening within the human mind, social constructionists looking at what's happening between people, and critical theory looking at what's happening with dominant societal discourses and how those affect the individual. But all of these are looking at how we construct meaning, even within our own head, is highly influenced by our societies that we are a part of. They talk about language being more formative than representative, meaning that we do, as we've said, we construct our reality primarily through language. And they look at how the language we use shapes our experience of reality and how we shape the meaning of the words that we're using. And if you look at, in society, any, words can constantly change meaning, and depending on how they are used within groups. For example, queer was once a slur used against LGBTQ community, and at a certain point that went from being a slur to something that an identity that they owned and redefined. And so you have this shift in the meaning of the word queer. You've also seen it shift in the meaning of the word gay over time, right? So all of these, so language is living, it is constantly evolving. And so from a postmodern perspective, they're looking at, society giving us the meaning, but as we talk with our friends and in our communities, we can reshape and change the meaning of words. And so they're conscious of that and using that even in session. So especially when we're looking at how we identify ourselves and how we identify the problem, and you'll see that. For example, in narrative therapy, they very much focus on, they will often use this process of externalizing the problem. So rather than constructing the problem as something that's, within us, something that's part of us, they construct it as the problem is something outside of us. You can have a relationship to this problem, ADHD or depression or whatever it might be. And they found that when you take the problem from being something that you are, an adjective that describes you, or a condition that you have, to this external force, that people had a greater sense of agency when they conceptualized it like that. So you'll see that language is used very skillfully and very intentionally in these approaches. And that is where postmodern approaches are very hard to learn to do well, because it requires this real philosophical shift in how you personally experience reality, and realizing how words shape our experiences in ways we don't consciously recognize typically when it's happening. But there's a real subtlety in how language is used in solution-focused, narrative, and collaborative that's very hard to perceive when you're just watching someone do the work. It's the hardest part of these theories to learn. Another concept they have is that knowledge is a communal achievement. It is not an individual one. And that all of the meanings we develop, especially those even around our identity, we're not just making those up in our heads. It is a communal experience. And if those around you aren't able to see you or define you the way you see yourself, you're going to have a hard time maintaining that identity. So postmodern therapists help clients untangle the dialogues around problems. And so oftentimes when you're working from a postmodern perspective, and let's say recently I was working with I was actually doing training, live supervision around a client with who was blaming themselves related to asexual assault is what was happening. And so, the traditional way to handle that type of thing would be to rush in, and when the client starts blaming themselves, to psychoeducate and tell them, that no, it's not your fault. And there certainly could be a place for that. But where the postmodernist starts, and from a postmodern perspective, what you're going to do first, before you give them your worldview, you're going to be very curious as to where they got those ideas. And, is there a friend? Is there a family? Is it something they've seen or heard, right? Would you feel the same way with your friends? You're looking for how this unique client makes sense of things, and you're tracking these threads, because there's usually multiple relational experiences. And so relationships can be society. It can be, when you're taking media, but these voices kind of like shape how we see ourselves and our roles in the world and what happens to us. And so postmodernists are really focused on that. And so they look at how all these pieces come together when they're working with their clients. And certainly at a certain point with this example, right, you might bring in the professional perspective on victim blaming around sexual assault, but it's not going to be where you're going to start. You're going to start by understanding their particular threads of meaning that are feeding their unique sense of self-blame is where you're going to start. And then you take the psychoeducation, it's like a little puzzle piece that might fit in with their unique construction of their experience. And so that way, when we do offer something to our clients, we always do it within their meaning-making structure rather than making a ton of assumptions based on a dominant cultural norm. Multiple realities, if you start doing couple work, for sure, often with families, but almost always with couples, they're like literally different realities that each partner often comes in with. And so that's a very common experience. Do not waste time necessarily like putting them together. I have learned to like, whoo, boy, I don't know. Is that really the same party you went to? Do you guys really go to the same thing? But there is this understanding that the realities are so different that like, you often can't get the timelines to line up in the beginning of treatment. So, but understanding that their unique experience is layered by a lot of societal, community, family of origin type of things that are shaping how they see the events that are unfolding, and really working with these realities rather than trying to find the objective truth between them, honoring that there really can be two very different realities in the same room. They think of self in a very different way than we typically do in mental health, rather than, the humanistic therapies really talk a lot about an authentic self. In postmodernism, they talk about a relational self, and that the self is really a social construct. And they oftentimes there are multiple selves that we have. We might have the who we are at work, who we are with our family of origin, who we are with our partner or our kids, or there are these different selves that are shaped by each context and each relationship that we are a part of. And it may not be a problem it may be a problem, but it may not be a problem. And it's just realizing that who we are, how we interact, what's authentic in one context may not be authentic in another. And so really just trying to understand a person's experience of identity and to help them construct identities that really help them to thrive, and most importantly, have a sense of agency where they feel like they can influence what is going on in their life. They talk a lot about culture, and John Schotter is a postmodern thinker more than a therapist, and talks about culture in a very interesting way. And they talk about that humans have created cultural norms, cultural rules. So this is a system. They don't use the term system, but it is a system if you think systemically. That culture is something, is a system of shared meanings that we need to organize our joint behavior. If we didn't know when you're greeting someone, whether they're friendly or not, we have these signals of a handshake or raising your hand. Different cultures have different symbols, right? Or interaction patterns that they use to signal, I'm safe, I'm friendly. So culture is necessary to coordinate meaning. And if you can't coordinate meaning, you cannot coordinate social action. Everyone's just lost and disorganized, right? There is no way to know what's safe, what's not safe, how we're going to get food, how do we do shelter, how do we connect, and relate with one another. There has to be some cultural context, some set of meanings that are arbitrarily kind of agreed upon to organize our behavior. And so, so every culture on the planet has grown up, has evolved with its own unique sense of shared meanings to organize their behavior. This is how we date in this culture. This is what work is. This is how we live. This is, where we live, how we have shelter, how we get food. This is how we signal safety. This is how we signal conflict, right? All of that, there are cultural things. And if we didn't have these, we could not get along. Society could not evolve. So the problem is that every culture on the planet, every culture there ever has been, every culture there ever will be, has to limit certain behaviors and say, this is good and safe. This is the signal for safety. We're friends. This is the signal for danger. We are not friends. This is not friendly behavior. And so that can vary widely across different cultures, including like how far to stand apart from someone, right? So certain behaviors get oppressed in every culture to some degree. So to a certain extent, oppressing certain behaviors is part of every culture, whether when you're in it, you don't see it because this is what's nice. This is the good behavior. That's the bad behavior. And so the key is, right, how do we make humane cultures? And so the key really is, how does a given culture treat dissenting voices. And so the more a culture is able to create mechanisms that allow dissenting voices to be heard respectfully in a safe way, the more humane that culture is. The more a culture simply shuts down dissenting voices or voices that are different, the more inhumane that culture is. So typically you would describe authoritarian governments as having very little freedom or safety for dissenting voices. They are often very harshly silenced, is what we would call an authoritarian, totalitarian type of government. Where a culture that leans more in a democratic system is going to have spaces, formal spaces even, right? The minority voices in a Congress, but they're formalized and they're allowed to be heard. And it creates a more humane system, more humane culture. Is it perfect? Never. And arguably, all we can do is try to make our systems more humane, try to include as many dissenting voices or voices that are different and other, and find ways. And it's going to create an increasingly complex system in order to become a more humane system. And so they talk a lot about dominant discourses and marginalized voices. So dominant discourses are kind of the loudest voice in a given culture, who has the most influence on what behaviors are considered good or okay and which ones are not. When the marginalized voices are the ones that don't, experience or who have a different sense of norms. So you can have, for example, in many societies, the male voices are have control over the dominant discourses, and female voices are marginalized. Their experience is marginalized. So if you look at many forms of history around the globe, it's a lot about what the men were working on, a lot less about what the women were doing. And when you read history, so then this happens in multiple different ways, these grand narratives, and then kind of marginalized voices within any culture. And every culture has marginalized voices. And most of us align with some of the dominant discourses in our world, in our lives, and have other parts of us that are marginalized or our experiences are marginalized. And so the challenge really is to create increasingly kind of humane cultures where all the voices can be heard and respected, and finding ways to invite these voices in that have been historically marginalized in whatever group that you're a part of. And this is never even steady. So, I live in the United States, certainly have male voices typically are setting the tone to the dominant discourse. But I teach for my career, I've taught in graduate programs, right, that are often master's level graduate programs in marriage, family therapy, and counseling, tend to be 80 to 90% females, right? So all of a sudden, many of the males in our program finally find themselves in this flip where female voices are quite dominant in these programs rather than male voices. And so even one person can have multiple different experiences around being marginalized, even around a single facet of identity. And so, what postmodern therapists are very conscious of is knowing that where a person experiences marginalization, which may not even always be obvious on the surface, you don't always know. It can be within their family of origin. Like I said, it can be within their grad program, flip some of the rules on them. But making sure that these marginalized voices we're able to give voice to them, able to respect them, and find ways to bring them into the discourse, into the dialogue, into how we're thinking about problems and solutions in a way that moves things forward. And so learning how to make space for these marginalized voices is very much something that postmodern therapists will do. You'll also notice they often don't even try to force a single narrative. They allow these multiple contradictory perspectives to actually linger in the air during a family session. This is what, let's say dad thinks a problem is. This is what mom thinks a problem is. This is what grandma thinks a problem is. This is what, the oldest daughter and the youngest son might think the problem is. And they will allow all of those voices to hang in the air rather than quickly push towards consensus, because they know each person, if you respect each voice, you allow it to hang in the air, that people are going to kind of make their own meanings from this and begin to shift how they see things in a way that isn't forced by the clinician. So there's a lot of work they do on that end in postmodern approaches. So I'm going to wrap up here just by talking about the postmodern spirit. And so from a postmodern perspective, there is this real curiosity, a humility, where realizing that what we are doing is we are constructing meaning together here. I'm constructing a reality here, and that I'm going to do it with this client together in a way that creates the most agency for this person. And there's this real fluidity to meaning. They realize that language and meaning is very, very fluid, and they allow for it to work with that fluidity rather than trying to label people and put them in a box, check a box, get the, standardized treatment plan and Rather than trying to organize and categorize people, they're allowing this flow to go back and forth to understand what or kind of organically makes sense to this client and works for this client. And so the one thing you will notice when you watch postmodern clinicians work, they are just masters in hope, optimism, possibility, strengths. And, they realize that, anything that is a problem or a weakness in one context is a strength in another. And there's this real kind of polarity going on with humanity, right? So, someone who's highly organized might do really great in school, but they might struggle in some of the social contexts that aren't as organized, that are more fluid or organic. So, for example, an extroverted person can be great at socializing, networking, building connection. But boy, if I want to have someone who is going to negotiate, a better, car deal for me, I want an introvert. It's going to be much better at strategically knowing how to say things, not saying too much, So when something's much more sensitive, very legalistic, or you're trying to be strategic in your talking, an introvert's always going to do a better job there. So no matter what you have, and like worry, people who have anxiety or worry a lot, right? That weighs them down. But in another context, they're exactly who you want to plan your next vacation or your next party, because you're so good at anticipating potential problems and solving them before they happen. So postmodernists also have this very kind of flexible way of looking at things and understanding how we have so much power really to influence our reality by how we see it, how we define things, how we use language together to create new realities. So there is this real hopeful spirit that you will find with postmodernists in terms of how they approach their work. And so I find a lot of people are attracted to postmodern approaches, but really struggle at implementing them because there isn't enough of this postmodern shift, this postmodern spirit. And it is something where I think you really do need to get some in-depth training and kind of hanging out how to think and work this way. It's certainly not something you're going to learn from a book, I would say. So I think a lot of the concepts people really resonate with in the 21st century, but learning to do this work, I highly recommend you get some, skilled training in how to use that language and develop. It's almost like this way of seeing how we are constantly constructing reality with everyone around us, and how we can use whatever is going on as a potential resource for whatever our struggles are. So they're very good at being able to identify strengths when other people would really struggle to do so.